Friday, isn't it? So before we start today's lecture and introduce you Professor of Power, I would like to extend a very thankful to the Latin American Studies Association, LASA, and especially Milagros Pereira here, the Executive Director of LASA, for sharing with us and lending us Timothy Power, that he's here for at least 1 hour sharing his visit. And of course, I was going to mention, this is like the big committee of strategic planning of LASA, and we also have Catalina Romero from the Universidad Católica de Peru, and Gilbert, Joseph Gilbert, unfortunately, he just left. But thank you for accepting to do this. So Timothy Power is Associate Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Oxford University. He's also the Director of the Brazilian Studies Program. And from 2008 to 2012, he directed the Latin American Center at Oxford. His focus is on democratization and political institution, parties, legislators in modern Latin America, but especially in Brazil. He has written on democratic transition, on the political right in the 90s on Brazil, and politics of constitutional design. He initiated the Brazilian Legislative Survey in 1990, and he is now co-directed with Cesar Zucco in the Fundação Getúlio Vargas. His recently work is on the consequences of coalitional presidentialism in Brazil and collaborating on a cross-regional project on coalitional presidentialism in Africa, Latin America, and post-communist Europe. Besides, I'm not going to mention all your publications because we are going to spend too much time here. Just want to mention that he also served as a treasurer of the Latin American Studies Association, past president of BRASA, the Brazilian Studies Association, part of the current part of the Strategic Plan Oversight Committee of LASA, Associate Director of the Journal of Politics in Latin America, Comparative Political Studies, Latin American Politics and Society, Política y Gobierno in Mexico, and Datos in Brazil. So it's like very extensive summary. So thank you so much, and let you.
Thank you very much, Angelina, and thank you for the kind invitation. And thank you for making me feel so welcome by bringing me the weather that I'm very I feel right at home today. I just make a quick disclaimer that I'm very jet lagged, so this is why I asked if I could speak in a seated position. I've had some jet lag issues on other short visits to the U.S. So I'd like to do a few things today. First of all, to sort of think a bit about the current crisis in perspective, and maybe I should have used the word crisis in plural on the slide, because really Brazil over the last couple of years has had several simultaneous crises. Obviously the biggest economic recession since the Great Depression, the biggest corruption scandal in its history, an impeachment crisis which is partly related to those two things. Also the pressures of the mega events, the Olympics of 2016, and then the secret crisis, which was kind of a black swan in the whole process of this. So it really should be in plural, and Brazil has probably never been as challenged as it has been over the past year or so. So we're thinking of a regime that is now past 30 years old. Democracy took effect basically on March 15, 1985. This is a photo of actually 2 months earlier, the day that Tancredo Neves won the presidency. And of course the last two presidents here in happier days of friendship. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit, give a brief historical view of Brazilian democracy, and then talk about 3 phases of the post-1985 regime, and then looking at causes and outcomes of the current crisis. So I think one of the first things that has to be said in sort of Brazil's favor is that these crises can occur at a very strong historical moment of democracy. These are the Polity scores for Brazil over the course of the 20th century. Polity is a data set that measures basically the level of democracy or the lack of authoritarianism in a country. And you can can see the two democratic experiences of Brazil quite clearly on the graph. The one from 1946 to 1964, and then followed by the coup. You can actually pick up things like the liberalization of 1974 and that line, that trend line, and then finally the transition to democracy in 1985. So it's happening at a moment in which the country has democratic procedures and institutions in place that can help it cope. Another way to look at it is to think about democracy in the way Robert Dahl thought about democracy in terms of two dimensions, contestation and participation. So in this graph, this is a very simple operationalization of what he was talking about, competition being measured by sort of the pluralization of the party system, which is the red bars that you see there. And then on the right axis, you have the percentage of Brazilians who could vote, and that's in the blue trend line. So, I mean, if you look at the first democracy in the 1950s, 46 to 64, you're talking about a moderate multi-party system, and you're talking about a fairly restricted suffrage. Actually, a lot of people are not familiar with that sort of information, but in the first election after the war, after the Second World War, only 16% of Brazilians were eligible to vote. And removing barriers on suffrage, part of this is also caused by sort of rising literacy, socioeconomic modernization, but the end of restrictions on suffrage in the 80s led to a much higher rate of participation. So if you look at the two democratic regimes on this graph, you see that the first one is very anemic compared to the current one. I mean, they're both described as democracies, but the current one is much more robust. Now that's a positive view of competition. There's also the negative view of competition, because if we look at Brazil against other Latin American countries, it is by far the most politically fragmented country in the region. So two indicators that we use in political science to talk about fragmentation would be the effective number of parties in Congress, which is not the absolute number, the weighted number of parties, and the percentage of seats that are actually under the control of the president's nominal party. So if you combine those two things into a single index, it gives you this sort of measure, what I call the index of coalitional necessity. In other words, how user-friendly is the presidency? Does the president have to build coalitions of many parties, or can he or she govern more or less on his own? So the countries least in need of coalitions in Latin America are the ones that have hegemonic parties, like Ecuador, Nicaragua, to a certain extent Bolivia. And at the top, you have places like Guatemala, Chile, and Brazil. Actually, there's been a lot of movement on this in recent years. Colombia never used to be like this. Colombia would have been way down here historically. And probably you would say the same about perhaps Costa Rica as well. Costa Rica was a historically two-party system until fairly recently. So, in other words, the presidents in Brazil have to work hard to fashion multi-party coalitions on the floor of Congress. This is what Brazilians call coalitional presidentialism, and it's a major factor in understanding the current crisis. So this is just the same data, but looking at Brazil compared to the rest of the region. It is the place where the presidents have the hardest time, at least mathematically the hardest time, in forming majorities. Another way to look at the legacy leading up to this regime is to think about the performance of the economic performance of Brazilian regimes. This is per capita GDP growth expressed in a constant indicator, which is actually US dollars of 2013 throughout the modern period from 1930 to the present. And what you can see is actually, for a very sad historical coincidence, the fastest growth was under the most repressive period, actually, under the military regime, where per capita income close to tripled in the first 15 to 20 years of the military regime. But then what you see here is the stagnation right before the transition. This bar represents the transition to democracy in 1985. The stagnation that you see in many countries because of the debt crisis in the early 80s. And then what happens in Brazil, for the first 20 years or so of democracy, there's really no movement. When Lula was arrested in 1980, which is here, and when Lula took office in 2002, which is here, there was basically no change in per capita income in Brazil, and it's 22 years of stagnation, right? So only in recent years did it begin to improve again. So the comparison for Brazilians who are old enough to remember the military regime and then lived through the first 15 to 20 years of democracy, the comparison between dictatorship and democracy was not very favorable to democracy on this very narrow materialist kind of indicator. Again, I take no pleasure in saying that. It's just a fact of the way the historical sequence was. So if you look at support for democracy using the standard Latino barometer question, democracy is preferable in green. Under some circumstances, an authoritarian regime could be preferable, that's in red. And then the kind of indifference curve, which is in blue. For people like me, may die, well, you know, it doesn't matter to me what political regime we have. Brazil, you know, obviously the gap between the green and the red line is what really matters. Is by what proportion do Democrats outnumber authoritarians? And if you look at this compared to other countries like Argentina, almost next door, it's not very flattering. Argentina has had objectively worse performance, but has a higher percentage of Argentines supporting democracy. Possibly for historical reasons, because the authoritarian regime in Argentina was so much more disastrous in economic and repressive terms. I'm afraid that I couldn't update this graph in time for today, but if you're curious, in 2016, the green line drops by 22 points in the last year. 22 points. As a result of dissatisfaction with the crisis. And this doesn't mean that it's necessarily a right or left thing. Both sectors have reasons to drop that line, right? We can talk about that later. So I would say that democracy since 1985 can be divided into three phases, and I'll do this very briefly. A first period, which was a very unsuccessful period. Angelina mentioned that in 1990 I was working on a survey. I was actually sharing an apartment in Brasilia with Barry Ames at the time, and we were living through inflation rates of, 80% a month or something like that. It was a lot. It was a lot. We used to go to restaurants and they would give us the menus in pencil, right? And they'd erase them and write the prices in again a few hours later. So that was the Brazil from 85 to 93. Hyperinflation and a great amount of political instability. The death of the first president before he could be sworn in, and that's Cardoso, his advisor behind him. This president being sort of unable to set foot in public after 1987 because he was so unpopular. And then the first fully popular elected president who was impeached, Fernando Collor. So the Brazilian democracy got off to a pretty poor start in terms of that level of performance. Then kind of a long cycle, some might use the term sort of a sustained social democratic cycle, or at least a somewhat inclusive cycle, featuring governability and social inclusion. It had two sub-phases, the Cardoso phase and the Lula phase, in which inflation was brought under control, and you had then a long period of social inclusion led by the PT. The sequencing had to be that way. Finances had to be brought under control. The state had to be reformed by Cardoso before Lula was able to work his magic in that period. So it was actually a fortuitous sequencing between those two presidents who, I think it's fair to say, are overachievers relative to the rest of the Brazilian political class. I would say that's a charitable way of putting it. Then maybe a third phase, which is a recent one, that I might call like a sudden onset malaise, because in 2011, Brazil seemed to be riding high, 2010, and then very quickly, 2013 to the present, series of protests leading to the current crises that we know about. So this is the protest in Sao Paulo, June 2013. My favorite one of these, there's many different demands there. my favorite one is this one, I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "É tanta coisa que não cabe nesse cartaz." So, and that's just Brazilian sense of humor at its best. But let's look more closely at this sort of the yin and yang of Brazilian politics. Lula and Cardoso, 1995 to 2010. This is them in the late 70s working against dictatorship together. This is the day of the transition, 2003. And this is Cardoso visiting Lula in hospital during his cancer treatment about 4 years ago or something. So these two people have a relationship which is conflictual, but also a very important phase that one governed right after the other. And during that period, I think you can say that it was a kind of a bi-coalitional system, by which I mean not a two-party system, but two coalitions, one led by Cardoso and his allies, and one led by Lula and the PT's allies, with some parties that move between the two, right? Some parties like were shuttle parties, pivotal parties that move between the two. But during this long cycle, there was a kind of reasonable or implicit consensus between the two coalitions. I don't mean a pact, I just mean a loose, elastic consensus. One was on the basic lines of macroeconomic policy, which we can go into, Basic lines of social policy, although Lula did much more than Cardoso. The PSDB, by and large, did not resist the major initiatives of the PT, at least in the 2000s. A complete revision of the federal pact in Brazil that was really led by Cardoso, but which benefited Lula tremendously. A consensus on the modus operandi of politics, which is basically the idea that you have coalitions. And so Lula's method of governing with an inclusive, oversized coalition basically copied the Cardoso model. So what I would say is Cardoso kind of wrote the manual de usuario for coalitional presidentialism. Right? He's the person who revived it. And then, I won't talk about this, but they obviously had very different approaches to the content of their foreign policies. One was much more south-south than the other. But they both agreed that Brazil was punching below its weight in international relations, and so both presidents were personally highly involved in foreign relations and upgrading Brazil's visibility on the global stage. So I think these were 5 points that sort of loosely connected those two experiences in government. Although they each claimed to be totally different from the other, for political reasons, they weren't. There were a lot of points of similarity. And so by and large, the country did not really object to this consensus. One indicator that's quite interesting is that if you look at that period from 1995 to 2014, 20 years, Brazil had the fewest finance ministers of any major economy in the world, only 3 people. And you know, in 1993, Brazil had 7 finance ministers or something like that in 1 year. So it's quite a sea change from earlier periods. And if the country had objected to that duopoly, you wouldn't have seen numbers like this. Basically, Brazil is very schizophrenic in the sense that it has a highly fragmented party system for the legislature. But in the last 7 presidential elections, really, last 6 anyway, 2 parties have emerged as the most important presidential competitors. That's the parties of Cardoso and the parties of Lula. So they've been winning between 70 and 90% of the two-party of the vote for president, but have never really advanced beyond a third of Congress. I don't really know any other historical example of something like this. We have a really fragmented party system, but 2 parties consistently top the executive race. That probably will not repeat in 2018, but you never know. You know, if Lula runs and there's a strong Tucano candidate, it could happen again. But one way to look back at this period again is to use sort of the poverty rate. If you look at the poverty rate of the country, it's a very good way of telling the recent history of the country. And these are the lines for poverty and extreme poverty from 1980 to 2012. You see quite clearly here, poverty was extremely high during the early 80s debt crisis. There was a dramatic improvement during a short-lived economic stabilization plan called the Cruzado Plan, that was only 9 months, 1986. And then the period of hyperinflation I was talking about previously, late 80s, early 90s. Then you have Cardoso's plan, the Plano Real, which brings down poverty to about 36% for 8 years, but Cardoso never was able to get it down. What that reflects is the beneficial consequences of ending hyperinflation. But after that, Cardoso was not able to bring that line down. But of course, the PT, after 2003, brought those lines down quite dramatically. If I show you real minimum wage and household income per capita, which are 2 other very useful indicators, they're expressed in constant reais here. You see again a dramatic increase after 2003, after the PT takes power. And you also probably are all familiar, you probably heard ad nauseum many papers and presentations about Bolsa Familia. I won't go into it, but it's the world's largest conditional cash transfer program. Contrary to popular belief, it's not the main driver of the reduction of poverty, but it is important in raising per capita and household income. Household income. But there are other reasons for the reduction in inequality in Brazil besides Bolsa Familia. And then finally, inequality, which is the red line, the Gini coefficient of income inequality. It's an impressive decline, but Brazil has gone from being like the 3rd most unequal country in the world to the 15th most unequal country in the world. So there's only 175 more countries before Brazil creeps up behind Norway and starts breathing down its neck. But it's interesting to see that, though, because many of us believed that inequality was really inertial and intractable in Brazil. We were wrong about that. It could be brought down. Of course, this line has stopped in the last couple of years. And an HDI, Human Development Index, which that's not an interesting line because all of Latin America pretty much looks like that. But you know, over the period of, especially the Lula years, this is one of the fastest changing societies on the planet. So if you look at the typical consumption categories that are used in marketing industry, class A, B, C, D, and E, which are basically, again, consumption and not sociological conception of class. People call them classes. This so-called classe C, which is what some people call the new middle class, let's say, people emerging out of poverty to a minimal level of social inclusion and consumption. This sort of doubles over that period, in a very short period, from 66 to 120 million people. 120 million people in the so-called nova classe media, that's the population of Japan or Mexico. It's just a very large consumption category in Brazil. But what Lula and the PT brought about was a consumption revolution, not an anti-capitalist revolution or anything like that. Right? They included people as consumers. And of course, this had real political effects. I want to take you back in time to the year that Lula wins the presidency. So this is a while back now, but the presidential candidates that year were Lula in red here, José Serra, who's now the foreign minister of Brazil, in blue, Anthony Gauchinho from Rio in yellow, and Ciro Gomes in purple here. And what you see, the electoral map for the presidential race is very much a mixed, kind of splotchy map. And you can especially see that PT and PSDB were competing all over the national territory. You had regional candidates like Gauchinho here and Ciro Gomes in the northeast. But generally, the other two parties were winning votes in a distributed way. But if I take you forward 4 years later, after 4 years of the pro-poor policies of the PT, the map looks like this, right? So, in other words, there's an electoral realignment for the presidency in which the PT does extremely well in the poorest areas of the country, and the PSDB does well in the others. So that's a map of election results, but I could be showing you a map of poverty, and it would look almost the same. It's very similar to a map of extreme poverty in Brazil. And then, so the candidates that year were Lula, Geraldo Alckmin, who's a very big winner this month in the municipal election, Eloísa Helena, and Cristóvão Buarque. And then in 2010, you see a similar thing. When Dilma succeeds Lula, she basically holds the PT base very well, and she actually does a bit better in Rio Grande do Sul, which is the state where she built her political career. And just one more slide like this. This is the 2014 election, and these are municipalities in Brazil. You probably can't read the legend, but 5,570 municipalities plotted on these graphs, and this is Dilma's vote share. This is down here, 0, 20, 40, 60, 80, and this is Human Development Index of each municipality. Brazil has incredible data on these things. And so in places with very low municipal human development, like 0.5, 0.4, this is sub-Saharan African levels of human development, she's getting something like 75, 80% of the vote. And up here where you have Southern European levels, 0.75, 0.8, she's getting 15% of the vote. Aécio Neves was the PSDB candidate, exactly the opposite pattern, and a much more mixed bag for Marina Silva, who was the third place finisher. And without beating a dead horse here, but this is the same graph for Bolsa Familia. So I mean, pro-poor policies made the PT a presidential powerhouse. That's basically the bottom line here. So in 2014, which is the last election we had, it seems like a million years ago, but it was exactly 24 months ago. You had a very backward-looking election. Looking at this period I've been describing, the Cardoso-Lula years, legacies matter. If you were to listen to Aécio and Dilma, and you were only hearing it on the radio, you would think it was Cardoso versus Lula, because each one was hitching their wagon to the, Aécio very much linking himself to Cardoso's legacy and Dilma to Lula's. And these are some of the stereotypes that we would hear. The legacy of Cardoso was economic stabilization. The legacy of Lula was social inclusion. Cardoso was reform without redistribution. Lula was redistribution without reform. And Cardoso was a government of reforms, and Lula's was a government of programs. These are different connotations. Reforms mean changing the Constitution, spending a lot of political capital to privatize and things, which cost Cardoso a lot of political capital. and Lula doing things inside the ministries in Brasilia, like Bolsa Familia. Bolsa Familia is run with a team of people, about as many as we are, out of the 7th floor of the Ministry of Social Development, and has revolutionized the lives of the poor. But it's an executive program that wasn't really, didn't have a lot of influence from the legislature or the courts compared to Cardoso's. And also another thing about 2014 is that the origins of political careers. This is Aécio Neves with his grandfather, who was elected president of Brazil in 1985. This is Eduardo Campos, who died in a plane crash, with his grandfather, Miguel Malaise, who was a major figure in post-war Brazilian politics. And then you have these two women running, Dilma Rousseff and Marina Silva, and they didn't come from oligarchic families, they came from Lula's cabinet, basically. In fact, Dilma was opposed in 2014 by 10 other candidates. Of the 10 other candidates, 6 of them were former members of the PT. So basically, you had 7 petistas out of 10 people in the election. And I think this is something that's an important legacy, because after the Vargas period, for the next 20 to 30 years after Vargas, most people were positioning themselves either as heirs to Vargas or opponents to Vargas' legacy. And we may see something similar in the sense of people trying to position themselves as the heir of the boom years of Lula. So, what explains this reversal of fortune in the last couple of years? I think this is what people are really curious about. They're curious about, headlines like this. How many years separate those two headlines? 4 years. The first one is 2009, 2013, right? A lot changed in Brazil in those years. What are some of the factors behind the crisis? We can think of both background factors and more proximal factors. The background factor might be the exhaustion of the favorable international trade winds that benefited Brazil during the golden years of the commodity boom. This is true for other countries as well. It's also true for a place like Australia, that were benefiting from Chinese appetite for commodities. With the slowdown of China, the votes didn't rise as fast. Cumulative corruption scandals, of course, which we can go into, but scandal within scandal within scandal until it becomes an alphabet soup of investigations. Some fiscal indiscipline under Dilma and an unsustainable increase in public employment and spending that had to be corrected at some point. It was not really possible to correct it in 2014 because Dilma was seeking a second term in office, which she won. Rising discontent over public services, which I think was probably at the root of 2013 protests. Although I have to say, there's a lot of disagreement about what was behind those protests. There's many different hypotheses about this, and there's no real consensus. I'll give one in a second. I think also one of the sort of climate factors in Brazilian politics is what you might call losers fatigue, in the sense that when you have a party winning 4 presidential elections in a row, you start to confirm the argument of Juan Lins that presidentialism creates too many losers and it's a winner-take-all system. We've seen this in other countries under the Thatcher period in Britain or the Reagan-Bush era in the United States. Multiple successive victories make it difficult for the opposition to sort of accept this. A very close election in 2014 exacerbated this because Aécio was defeated by 3.28 percentage points by Dilma. It was the closest election in modern Brazilian history. And a polarization that's exacerbated by media, and by media I mean both traditional media but also social media. I'm sure there's a lot of Brazilians in the room who are on the internet every day, and they can tell you that since 2013 or so, the Brazilian internet is a very poisonous place to visit. If you were to unplug the internet right now in Brazil, it would probably go a long way towards solving the country's problems. But social media, Brazil is a social media addict. It's number 2 in Facebook and Twitter accounts in the world, number 1 in WhatsApp, I think. And this doesn't help polarization, as we can see in this country as well. But over this period of the commodity boom, let's say these data are from 2005 to 2013, you ask public opinion surveys, what are the most important problems facing the country? And this is an open-ended question. So the top line is the ones who say lack of jobs. In other words, people who put unemployment, desemprego, as the first volunteer response. And the other line is an average of sort of quality of life issues. Healthcare, transportation, crime, and education. So basically what that graph tells us is a kind of a post-materialist argument, basically. As the economy stabilized, poverty fell, and unemployment fell, people began to be more concerned about other issues relating to the quality of life. And basically when those two lines cross, which is roughly 2013, you have the explosion of this dissatisfaction on the streets. Part of it is a rejection of politics, part of it is a rejection of corruption, part of it was spending on the World Cup, this sort of thing. But the original motivation in Sao Paulo was public transportation, and it spread like wildfire to other cities. Each city had a slightly different context, but services was clearly there. So we move now to an impeachment of a president. And I'm really sorry Aníbal isn't here because I was going to do some propaganda for his book, which is a great book about impeachment. So I'm talking about Aníbal Perezinyan from the university. He, in his book from 2007, argues that there were sort of 4 conditions that explain presidential removals or impeachments in Latin America. One being an economic crisis, another being corruption scandal, a third being the street, popular mobilization, and a fourth being a hostile legislature. So this is a conjunctural causation kind of argument. When these things work together, it becomes difficult for the president to stay in office. And you can see where I'm going with this, and you can see how accurate the model is for Brazil. The first condition, economic crisis, I don't need to go much further than this, but 3.8% decline in 2015, probably 3.5% in 2016. If you add those 2 years together, that's the economy of Peru, which has vanished from the books of Brazil in the last 30 months or so. It's an incredible contraction. Number 2, corruption scandals, and I won't go into the details of Lava Jato. I don't feel competent to do that, and I don't think anyone wants to rehearse all of that, but I can't even keep the investigatory agency straight, much less the details of the case, but a scandal that has hit virtually every political party, including the governing coalition. Number 3, popular mobilizations. 2013 was about services and transport, things like that, but beginning in 2014 and 15 it moved to corruption and anti-Dilma. So I would say the 2013 protests were not anti-government protests, because when the day that they started, Dilma had 65% approval, so they couldn't really be anti-government. And they weren't anti-regime, but they were anti-politics protests. 2015-16, these are anti-government protests, which are also countered by pro-government protests. I don't have a great picture of Brasilia, but they built this wall down the middle of the Esplanada dos Ministérios that separated the pro-impeachment versus anti-impeachment forces. They call it the governor of Brasilia is Roberto Hollenberg. There was a door on the wall, and if somebody hung a sign that said Portão de Hollenberg, which is like a play on the Berlin Wall. A fourth condition here, condition of a hostile legislature. This is a very good illustration of the gender balance in the Brazilian Congress. Eduardo Cunha, the speaker for 2015 and most of 2016, in an allied party to Dilma, but trying to basically wrest control of the national agenda from her, and becoming the worst sort of fair weather friend of the PT. So the collapse of the relationship between the PMDB and the PT, which is partial, but enough to swing the Vice President Temer to the impeachment side, it leads a lot of people to wonder whether this model of coalitional presidentialism in Brazil is still a viable model. These are the happier days of coalitional presidentialism. So there's Dilma at a cabinet meeting, and Temer sitting next to him, her, Jacques Wagner, chief of staff, etc. So why is the table so large? Well, at that particular moment, 2-3 years ago, there were 39 cabinet ministries in Brazil, plus the president and vice president. So the minimum number of people at a cabinet meeting in Brazil is 41. I mean, there are legislatures in Brazil, and legislatures in the world that are not much larger than that. But it had to be done that way to include parties in the cabinet. Right? So this is the kind of unwieldiness that you would see with coalitional presidentialism. Barry knows this very well, but over the past 15 years or so, there's been a stream or a strain of Brazilian political science which has been very favorable towards coalitional presidentialism, arguing that presidents have agenda-setting powers, legislative powers, portfolio powers, spending powers that allow them to manage these coalitions, right? You can give them jobs, you can give parties money, you can use legislation, decree laws, etc. to hold together coalitions. There's a very institutional approach to how coalitional presidentialism works, but I think it overlooked a couple of factors. One factor, and political scientists are terrible with dealing with it, is just the factor of leadership, right? We don't have good theories of it, we don't have anything much more than sort of judgments. I know good leadership when I see it, but I think most people who study Brazil would agree that Cardoso and Lula were much better at dealing with the political dialogue and negotiation that goes with coalition making than Dilma was. In 2013, in the Brazilian Legislative Survey, this is before the protests, we asked members of Congress, how would you compare Dilma to Lula in terms of her relationship with the coalition parties, meaning the partidos governistas? And overwhelmingly, people thought that it was a significant decline in the quality of dialogue. Dilma, remember, is a technocrat by formation and had never held elective office before winning the presidency, so she wasn't particularly well suited for this role. Whereas Lula was the kind of person Lula was very Reagan-esque in the sense that he didn't really know that much about the details of policies, but was extremely good at negotiating a small number of principles that were then worked out by his allies, and he would work the room. Other people would do the policy, but he would work the room. She did too much policy and never worked the room, and so her relations with her Congress were quite weak, always. So that's one thing. We missed leadership, and I think we misunderstood sort of one principle of coalitional presidentialism, which is that the pivotal party, the main support party for the president, can't really interfere in the agenda of the president, right? Under Cardoso, the PSDB made the agenda, and the PFL, which was his main party, the support party, helped to get support for that agenda. Under Lula, it was the PT and the PMDB, and that really was pretty much the way it worked until Cunha was elected the Speaker of the House in 2015, and began to develop an alternative agenda of political reform and trying to position the PMDB as a kind of a blackmail party rather than a support party in Congress. And so the pivotal party in coalitional presidentialism has to accept the hegemony of the president's agenda. Since Cunha didn't, there was a breakdown. I'm not saying that one was right or the other one was wrong, because obviously Brazilian presidentialism is very exclusionary. But the relationship broke down in 2015. So we have the case of impeachment in Brazil, and the impeachment was based on something called the crime of responsibility. Crime of responsibility is clearly meant to be defined by Congress, and Congress has a lot of authority as to what constitutes a crime of responsibility. And the Supreme Court of Brazil doesn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. They want to leave these interpretations largely to the politicians. So there is a hole in the Brazilian Constitution that's big enough to drive a truck through, basically. If Congress decides to call something a crime of responsibility, there's not really any way that you can deny Congress from having that particular will. Cunha, going back to Cunha, a year ago, is it a year ago? Yeah, it's a year ago, it's incredible. November 2015, Cunha was Chamber of Deputies President. He had 8 different impeachment requests on his desk, and they all had different reasons to impeach Dilma. The one that he chose was the one that prospered. It was the pedaladas fiscais, which is probably translated as like creative accounting, basically using state banks to cover operating expenses of the government in order to hide budgetary shortfalls. He could have chosen other ones, but he chose that particular one, which is a very narrow technical thing that even most members of Congress didn't quite understand very well at first. And even today, most ordinary citizens have a hard time explaining what a pedalada fiscal is. But that was the one that was chosen, and 3 lawyers were summoned to justify that as a crime of responsibility. So basically, this goes back to a reform that Cardoso implemented in 2000, which is called the Fiscal Responsibility Law. Under the Fiscal Responsibility Law, executives cannot borrow from banks that they control. That is the basic constitutional principle behind the Pedalada dos Fiscais. And so she borrowed from the Caixa Econômica and the Banco do Brasil. So we have this loophole. There's no judicial review of the impeachment articles. You have a very strange situation in which, in Brazil, where the accused president, who's impeached by the lower house, must stand aside and allow the vice president to take office while the investigation and trial continue in the Senate. But we all know what that means. We all know that the vice president will form an alternative government, implement other policies, and to a certain extent make it hard to return to the status quo ante. It could happen, but once Temer took office, Temer changed the cabinet, reorganized the government, implemented a different foreign policy for the nation, things like this. So it was quite difficult to dial it back. So I think the idea of governo interino in Brazil is a bit of a farce. In the US, when the president is impeached, the president remains in office and defends himself or herself from office. Another point here is the curse of the vice presidency. Brazil has been governed under democracy by vice presidents a good chunk of the time, something like 40% of the time or something like that. Because you had, well, going back to the crisis of the early 60s, an unelected vice president here, João Goulart, an unelected vice president in the 80s, José Sarney, unelected vice president in the 90s, and now another unelected vice president. And so in each one of these cases, you had parties winning the presidency that didn't have a snowball's chance in hell of winning the presidency on their own. Not a chance. I mean, the PTB in 1960, the PFL in the 80s, well, he had no party then. He was sort of the PMDB. And also the PMDB now. So there's a bit of agency loss with the vice presidency. Some Latin American countries make do without vice presidencies, like Mexico or Chile don't have them, and they haven't like died. So I mean, the question of whether Brazil needs a vice presidency, I think, is something that's worth talking about. One other issue here is this is the vote for impeachment that was at the end of April, and if you look at those numbers, these are very similar to the numbers on all of Cardoso's constitutional reforms in the 90s. The roll call votes look just like that in terms of numbers. A big center-right coalition defeating a marginalized left of 120 to 150, and Cardoso won one thing after the other. The left was very much marginalized. It's gone back to a system of the left against the rest, the center-right aligned against the PT. And I think if the left is marginalized like that, becomes a permanent loser again, Brazilian democracy suffers as a result. But this is what's happening under the Temer government. And you can see this in two sort of pieces of data. One is party identification. PT party identification was about half of all party identification in Brazil. This is the total number of Brazilians who had a party. And this is the number who said that they supported the PT. So about half of all Brazilians who cared about any party cared for one party, which is the PT. So the PT was an anchor of the party system. The decline in party ID for the PT removes one of the anchors of the party system and makes it much more deracinated, makes it more possible perhaps for a populist adventurer the next time around. That's a hypothesis. The other piece of data, which I don't have to show you, is the results of the elections 2 weeks ago, October 3rd, in which the PT went from about, I don't know, 12% of the vote in the last election to 5.5% of the vote for municipal elections, and saw the number of mayors reduced by more than a half. The PT now has fewer mayors in Brazil than the major right-wing party, which is the DEM, which is incredible, because 5 years ago the DEM looked like it was dead. So it's a big reversal for the party. So just to conclude, a few lessons to take away. Number one, I think the impeachment was a political process. It was a process that was decided by the political class to remove a president. No amount of constitutional analysis could have changed their minds. Nothing could have moved the needle on the majority that wanted to get rid of Dilma. Constitutionalism didn't really matter. Dilma was given the right to defend herself on August 29th and 30th. It was supposedly a trial, a testimony. It was actually like the longest exit interview in history, because all she did was speak for 12 hours while other people, she had 21 friendly questioners and 60 hostile questioners, and the next day it was 61 to 20 or whatever. I mean, it was a completely preordained outcome. Secondly, the constitutional bar for impeachment has been lowered so that unless there's a national debate about where that bar really should be, you end up having a de facto confidence vote system in which if you need to remove a president, you can find a way to remove a president, and that was done for Dilma. Obviously, there were, from a narrow legal perspective, there were crimes committed, but others argue that the pedaladas fiscais are routinely sort of committed by governors and presidents in the past. I'm not in a position to evaluate that, but it seemed like a rather obscure accusation. No one in the political class really gained from this. The opposition didn't have any sort of clear winner out of this. Probably the collective reputation of the political class either remained the same or went down if it's possible to go down, I don't think. But, and finally, what coalitional presidentialism in Brazil is not going away. What's really changing is the composition of coalitions. You can interpret the impeachment as kind of an intra-coalitional putsch in which the PT was pushed out along with the formateur of the coalition, and the coalition was recalibrated with the addition of a few other parties. But many parties, and even some ministers that were in Dilma's government, are also in Temer's government. So it wasn't a complete alternation in power at all. It was rather the expulsion of the PT and a couple of left-wing satellite parties, and the inclusion of the Cardoso alliance parties back into the coalition. But the PMDB in both. So what scenarios can we think about? I would say that for the next 2 years we can think about Brazil as being a 1993 followed by a 1989. This is an obscure reference, I admit, but 1993 was the year that Itamar Franco didn't know what he was doing and sort of was drifting in the water, and Brazil seemed ungovernable without an agenda and without a strong president. 1989 was the year in which the presidency was an open seat, and you had 22 candidates for president with a total free-for-all open race without an incumbent or an obvious leader at the beginning. So that would be the possibility for 2018. I mean, there's some big names that are planning to run, but there's also an open seat, likely to be an open seat, and you know, other names that will be jumping into the race, including probably for the first time a major anti-system candidate in 2018, which is Jair Bolsonaro. He's a congressman from Rio de Janeiro who defends the military regime. Right now he would win 6, 7, 8% of the vote if the election were held today. And that hasn't happened before. There hasn't been a major, right-wing anti-system candidate. There's been some clowns. Temer, unlikely probably to assert political primacy. He's not really suited for that. The 2016 elections, they weakened the PT, but they didn't really advantage anyone else. If you look at the results, the loss of the PT mayorships was distributed in a kind of somewhat random way among the other parties. Nobody really benefited, but the PT really lost. So I would expect an inflated number of presidential candidates in 2018, and a second round election, if it goes to that in 2018, could look a lot like 1989, where everyone gangs up against the left. That would be the case if Lula were to run and make it into the second round. If Lula's candidacy is authorized, there's no judicial obstacles to it. Right now, he would probably finish in the top 2 without too much trouble. So just to conclude, I would say probably one of the things that we have to do here is to take the headlines with a grain of salt, and Brazil will continue to surprise us. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Should I just
sure.
take my own questions? You can put the lights back on if you want.
Yeah, I've seen the president two positions. Some say that what's happened shows that institutions are now well established in Brazil because the level of corruption happened also because people didn't think they would be made responsible for this. Others consider that this crisis shows that corruption is business as usual and things have not changed at all in Brazil. What do you think about it?
That's a great question. There's a kind of another line in Brazilian political science right now, which is arguing that one of the major developments over the past 15, 20 years has been the development of a web of accountability institutions, which is very complex in Brazil. It's probably more complex than any other Latin American country. You have the Ombudsman's Office, which is called the Ministério Público. You have the CGU, the Contraloria Geral da União. You have the PGR. You have the Receita Federal. You have the Federal Police. And you have the investigatory committees in both houses of Congress, the CPIs and things like this. And they're all very impressive on their own. In fact, one of the hardest things about following the scandal is to figure out which agency is actually driving, and I left out federal judges. Federal judges are also very important too. But I think the counter sort of argument to that is that although many of these agencies are very impressive and effective and have a high level of professionalization, that they're not very well coordinated horizontally among themselves. So it's more like an alphabet soup of agencies rather than a web of agencies. My colleague at American University, Matthew Taylor, is the person who would sort of advance that argument. So some people have argued sort of for the creation of like a ministry of anti-corruption or a ministry of accountability, which could be like putting the fox in charge of the chicken coop kind of thing. Might not work very well. But I think in terms of opposition to corruption, the public opinion data have pretty much falsified this idea of rouba mais faz, right? This sort of myth in Brazil that people are tolerant of corruption when executives are doing their job. I mean, I think Brazil has probably moved beyond that. There's some recent papers that have sort of argued that if that attitude is held, it's really held only at the highest level of wealth and education. It's not something among ordinary Brazilians at all. As long as we have coalitional presidentialism with minority presidents who need to build coalitions, there will be exchanges of favors to sustain those coalitions, right? When you had one party controlling Petrobras, et cetera, for such a long period of time, parties knew where to knock on the door to get campaign finance, and a lot of people would trace it to the problem of coalitional presidentialism. So I guess in that sense, my response is pessimistic because coalitional presidentialism is not going away. It has to be combined with more effective oversight. Other questions, comments? Yes, in the back, please.
Yeah. First, just like a technical question and sort of a broad question. As far as what you mentioned, as far as the constitutional loophole, and government not being able to borrow from the banks it controls, I feel like you mentioned a specific piece of legislation that made that the case. So what year did that happen? And then kind of the broader question, how do you see this sort of, what does this mean for kind of democracy in Brazil? It's kind of a big question, I feel like.
Yeah.
And then also, given that Brazil is such an important country in Latin America and the world, how does this fit into kind of debates about how democracy is going at a global level or at a regional level? People are saying that we're in this midst of a democratic recession, or kind of maintaining steady, or where would you kind of see this process fitting into that?
Yeah, your first question is easy, and your second one's really hard. The first question is the specific legislation that prohibited executives from borrowing against their own banks is called the Law of Fiscal Responsibility. It was passed in 2000. So it was passed in the final years of Cardoso's presidency. It wasn't really intended to presidents, it was intended to governors, because governors were the ones who were really fiscally indisciplined in the 90s. They would borrow from their own state-controlled banks for pet projects, be unable to repay, and then the federal government was required to bail them out. So that practice basically ended then. But this was the constitutional sort of argument to underline the accusation of pedaladas fiscais against Dilma. Now the broader question about democracy in Brazil. Well, those of us who work with LASA can tell you that the LASA conference in May in New York City had quite a vigorous debate over this. Some people arguing that the impeachment and removal from Dilma meant the end of democracy. I mean, that was what a few of our speakers actually said. I would disagree with that expansive interpretation, but I also think that there's some worrying signs with the ease with which Congress was able to define the crime of responsibility. And there's no judicial oversight of the articles of impeachment. and also the alternation of power is immediate the day after accusation. So Temer took office on April 20th or something. Was confirmed in office on August 31st. So I mean, I think there are institutional reasons to be very concerned about the ease with which this could happen again in Brazil. But from the letter of the law perspective, I think there's a kind of a circle of what would be narrowly defined as constitutional, and it would be hard to say that they didn't follow the letter of the law. It's just that the Constitution is bad. It's just very, very, very ambiguous on this sort of thing. So is it linked to a democratic recession? I don't think so. I think it's like somebody said to me, like, remember the Olympic pool in Rio? Like one day it was blue and the other day it was green. It's like Brazilian democracy is exactly like that. One day it was blue, the next day it was green, but it's still a pool and you can still swim in it. It's okay. But the waters have been muddied a bit. I mean, but there'll probably be a re-equilibration with the elections of 2018. I mean, there was, when Temer went to speak at the United Nations in September, there was a walkout of 5 Latin American countries, the ALBA countries. But they, as far as I know, 1 or 2 of them did not post ambassadors to Brazil after the impeachment. But generally, the rest of the world recognizes the Temer government. So on a legal sort of narrow basis, it's legitimate in that sense, in the IR sense of legitimacy. But I would say that what happened in Brazil is very much a Brazilian process. It had to do with some of the factors I was talking about before: losers' fatigue, bad relations between the president and the executive, and a desire to get rid of Dilma. Some people have argued that it's a combination of effects. So if Dilma had been growing the economy and reducing poverty like Lula had done before, that these things would have been overlooked. But what you can't have is a recession and a corruption scandal at the same time. You can live through one or the other in isolation, but when they're together, it's a deadly combination. So I would say in that sense, that's a Brazil-specific effect and wouldn't be really linked to a democratic recession. There's been no symptoms of a democratic recession like we see in Venezuela or Ecuador or places like this, where harassment of the media or harassment of the opposition, like we see. There's nothing like that in Brazil. It was more of a, like I say, intra-coalitional push. Yes?
Yeah. Could you expand a little bit more on the issue of polarization? You mentioned polarization. So we can see on one hand the polarization of the elites, and on the other the polarization among citizens. What are the roots of that polarization? How does that relate with both parties and with the social policies that you mentioned?
It's a great question, and I think we need a lot of work to tease out all of the different aspects of polarization. But I mean, part of it has to do with, and I'll give you my personal view. I mean, there are others who will disagree with this, but part of it had to do with class tensions being aggravated by the PT's success in reducing poverty and inequality, right? So throughout the Lula years, all votes were rising, but they weren't rising at the same level. Okay, so among the poor, you had, in his second term, you had like what they call crecimiento chinés, Chinese growth, meaning that the incomes of the poor are rising like 8, 9, 10% a year. And then among the traditional middle class, incomes were rising like 1 or 2% a year. So it was like Belgian growth or British growth or something like that. So over time, there was a class resentment that among that particular group. That particular group also feeling that certain policies of social inclusion adopted by the PT were harming their own class privilege. Again, this is my own interpretation. I don't have any hard evidence to say this, but sort of if you look at the conservative media and some of the issues that they favor to delegitimate the PT, things like affirmative action, racial quotas in universities, adopting an American-style discourse about handouts and paternalism of social policy, that the Bolsa Familia was encouraging people to remain poor, was encouraging people to have more children, the sort of Fox Newsization of social policy. And so a lot of that developed in the conservative media over that period. So, I mean, the level of partisan activists and things like that, the polarization probably didn't increase. It's more like sort of, Barry can probably fill in the blanks on this, but the percentage of swing voters moving, you know, towards from tolerance of the PT in the 2000s to hostility to the PT in Dilma's second term was pretty drastic. There's two political scientists, Cesar Zucker and David Samuels, who have written on the roots of anti-pechismo, and it's very strong anti-pechismo is strongly correlated with income and skin color. This is sort of like the story I've just told. Yeah. Other comments or questions?
Well, let me ask you to elaborate on something. I think it was very good, very clear, really nice presentation. You're one of, aren't you one of the people who created the phrase of the Gire de Encacoliada? So I think I attribute that to you when I
Wasn't me.
well, I attribute you anyway. But the polarization that we observe, for example, among academics, that's really clear and sharp. I mean, that's one of the things I think you referred to the beginning. But if the battle against corruption is successful and leads, as it did in, for example, in Chile in the early 60s, to a decline in patronage, and as it has in the United States, in a decline, not so much here about corruption, but the decline in earmarks in the legislature. That pretty clearly, there's the argument in Venezuela's argument in Chile was that contributed to polarization in society and in the legislature itself, because the decline in pork barrel, basically, really talking about pork barrel, the decline in pork barrel made it not possible, not worth the trouble for people on the left and people on the right to get together and cooperate over something. Right? And we see that in the American Congress as well. There aren't any earmarks, and so the senator from Pennsylvania and the other senator from Pennsylvania don't cooperate across party.
The incentives for log rolling are...
Right, because there's nothing to get. There's no, and when you made the comment that the coalition, multi-party presidentialism, the secondary party, the family debate, isn't supposed to get involved in the agenda. I mean, in Europe, of course, they do get all the players are involved in the agenda at some point. You're right, of course, I agree. In Brazil, they're not involved in the agenda, but they are involved in pork.
Yes.
And if those kind of incentives decline, I mean, this, you know, if you think about what Carlos Pereira, his main central argument is about that, that the whole thing works because there's pork barrel. It's limited. He would say it's kept under control by the various agencias de control, but you have to have it. And if we get to the point where that's not there, either for financial reasons, fiscal reasons, or because these agencies naturally keep patronage and pork barrel under really fierce limits, then is it more, or is it even impossible to maintain multi-party presidentialism?
Yeah, those are really good questions. I mean, I would sort of distinguish among three things. Like pork barrel, I understand to be earmarks, right? Patronage, I understand to be public employment. And then what happened at Petrobras is neither of those things. I mean, there's a little bit of patronage in terms of jobs and things like that, but a lot of it was just illegal campaign finance or cash employees and things like that. So there's more than one gray currency in play. You know, earmarks was a legal thing. I mean, the Constitution allowed it. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this sort of debate that Barry's referencing, but from 1988 to 2014, the budget approved in Congress in Brazil was only a spending authorization. But then presidents had the ability to sign or not sign the actual disbursements. So because the president had this incredible carrot and stick power, these disbursements, what they call emendas individuais, they were used as ways to incentivize parliamentary behavior. But then in 2014, Congress rebelled and created an American-style budget in which the spending is mandatory from the get-go. And then in 2015, they amended the Constitution to change that permanently. So that whole tool that we talked about for 15 years in Brazilian politics is gone. And so basically, Dilma left the presidency much weaker than she found it, because she allowed the presidency to be stripped of this incredible tool. I mean, the tool obviously was used for all kinds of nefarious purposes, but it was a whip that presidents used really well, and she lost it. So, like, you know, going back to like Samuel Huntington used to say about presidential power, you know, like, if we made a list of the good presidents and the bad presidents, the good presidents are the ones who expanded the power of the office, and the bad ones are the ones who the power of the office declined. And she left the presidency much weaker than when she entered it. So that tool, the absence of that tool is going to affect the ability of presidents to govern multi-party coalitions going forward. And I think it's too early to say what the results of that is, because everything has been so unstable. The constitutional amendment only took effect about a year ago. But the next budget cycles, presidents won't be able to do that. So that gives more agenda power to the leading parties in Congress. They have a lot more say in the budget in the future than they did in the past. So being Speaker of the Chamber of Deputies becomes a more valuable post. Being head of the Budget Committee, which was already a powerful post, becomes more valuable. But what you were saying before is, like, if the battle against corruption is successful, right, this would change. I mean, I'm not sure what I would understand as being successful in Brazil. It would be bringing it down to a level that is less visible and more tolerable, right, but not totally eliminated.
And I think, here I value your point of view. I've been arguing that part of the story that we missed in the last few years in thinking about this was the importance of the empreiteiras, these, you know, enormous monster construction companies. Because if we look all the way back to in fact, when you and I were in Brazil a long time ago, when you were a kid, in the scandal of the Sudden-Onset, a wonderful story, but something we can tell people later. But that was about the same thing. It was about companies bribing deputies to put in the budget something that would say you're going to build something in municipality X. And now, of course, they're bigger than that now. But the demand for this kind of corruption, because of the importance of these enormous companies, their oligopolistic power. And there's so much money that you can bribe the Petrobras people, and then since the deputies all know what's going on, you can bribe them with profits. And that's what happened. And they know what's going on, so you pay them off. So you have this really oligopolized sector of industry that feeds off these huge projects. Yep. And now you have agencies that are trying to control that, and they're going to, I don't know if there's some kind of modus vivendi that can be reached or what their consequence that would be.
You know, I mean, the PT, obviously, you know, historically an anti-capitalist party, etc. They did reach a modus vivendi with the empreiteiras when they came to power. And one of the interesting things is how this connects to foreign policy, because Lula wanted to use the BNDES to bring the empreiteiras outside of Brazil, bring them to Africa and other places of the world to build roads and things like that. And this is what people call like flying the flag of BNDES. BNDES is the Brazilian National Development Bank, which would basically lend, they fund these projects and force the host country to hire one of these 12 or so Brazilian empreiteiras to build roads. So it actually feeds in. But Brazil is coming home now. I mean, the BNDES is coming back to Brazil. These things are declining pretty rapidly. But it was very interesting how the PT was able to work that into its own views for foreign policy. But these empreiteiras are completely delegitimated at the moment, and the heads of some of them are in jail. I mean, that's and some of you in the room, I know, are suing Petrobras, right? Because I think TIA-CREF is a party to a class action lawsuit. So I know that some of you are in this lawsuit.
Indirectly.
Indirectly, yeah. So 2010, the value of Petrobras was $300 billion. It was the 7th largest firm in the world and the 2nd largest energy firm. And now it's worth about $20 to $30 billion, right? So TIA-CREF and also the system I'm in the UK, USS, many others have sued Petrobras for exposing itself to corruption, inflating the values of its stocks, and they want their money back. So the lawsuit that Petrobras has to settle in the US would be $98 billion payout for Petrobras.
It's my retirement.
There you go, you're all set.
let me ask you one other question, so I don't see any hands up. And this was there hand up? No. Well, I want to ask about the payment they make. What happens if it remains a centrist party without a program? Because in most, when we think of European countries, certainly, and some Latin American countries too, center parties actually represent something, kind of, in policy terms. And, you know, going all the way back to Malaise, there's the arguments that PMDB is invertible.
That's right.
And if it continues to be, is there any, first, I guess, do you think there's any possibility that it will develop, this is an opportunity to develop a kind of centrist set of policies, which would include reforming the state and maintaining social programs, etc. Could it do that? What happens if it doesn't?
I think I would make a distinction between a center party and a pivotal party. A center party would mean that it actually might be programmatic and have policies that are halfway between left and right. So I think of the PSDB actually as being a centrist party. I mean, other people think it's a right-wing party. I think it's a party of the modernizing center. So it's like a programmatic party of the center, leaning center right now. The PT is a programmatic party of the left. Most other parties are very weak on the programmatic dimension. So, I mean, the coalitions we've been talking about today, captained by a programmatic party, and then many of the following parties are not programmatic at all. So I think the PMDB is like, it's a pivotal party because it's moved back and forth from the PT coalition to the PSDB coalitions and so forth. But it's not a center party in any meaningful sense because it's a kind of a programmatic wasteland in the middle. There's no sort of policy content to the PMDB at all. The only reason that we think it has policy content is because we happen to have a PMDB president who has brought ministers into the government and tasked them with coming up with policies. But these are done by like giving economic policy to Enrique Malaise and giving agrarian policy to Raul Yuman and people like that. But I don't think that the party waiting in the wings is a centrist party in the European sense at all. I think it's a pivotal party. So I mean, I wouldn't think of the center as having much content in that sense. You look unconvinced.
No, I think you're right. I just wonder what basically they stay small in terms of legislative representation. The biggest party. I mean, I guess what we need to figure out is what are the consequences of having a pivotal party that has to be part of any government in some years that has no program, and especially in a time of declining patronage and all those hooligans.
No, I mean, I think I tried to give an answer to that earlier in the presentation. I said that, and maybe I said it too strongly, but I do believe that coalitional presidentialism depends on clear agenda control by the former tour party, by the presidential party, and a delegation of the program to that party. So, like, that's what I meant by silent partners. When the PSDB was in power, the PFL was the Partido de Sustentação. That's the perfect phrase in Portuguese for this. Partido de Sustentação is a professional support party. The party lives only to provide support for governments. And that worked really well because the PFL never interfered in Cardoso's inner circle at all. And it worked pretty well for Lula as well. The PMDB had didn't even have the vice presidency during Lula's years at all, right? They had lots of ministries and it was bought off pretty well and never really interfered. But Dilma, I mean, whether you believe this or not, I mean, this is kind of things that people hear in Brasilia, but supposedly many people have heard Lula say privately that, you know, the two biggest mistakes he ever made in his life was inviting Dilma to be the nominee, and number two, telling Dilma to take Temer as her vice president. You know, Michel Temer has been the president of the PMDB for 14 years, I think, or something like that. So, I mean, the guy, he doesn't really have any programmatic content, any ideology or any beliefs or anything like that, but what he does have is the loyalty of the PMDB in Congress. So, I mean, that's where his strength lies, is that he controls the pivotal party. And I suppose having a president with strong partisan power is a good thing. Lula had that, Cardoso had that, and now maybe Temer has that. But what he doesn't have is ideological content. Good, yep.
So moving to the state level, how do you think the corruption scandal and the movement of Dilma out of the presidency is going to affect the government?
subnational level? Yeah. That's a great question. I haven't really thought about that, frankly. You know, I mentioned in response to an earlier question, the Lei de Responsabilidade Fiscal, which is from 2000, did change the governor's behavior in terms of at least lending to themselves and that sort of thing. But corruption scandals at the subnational level maybe don't quite have the same level of attention from national oversight agencies as the ones that are erupting in Brasilia. Each state has a Ministerio Público Estadual and that sort of thing, but these are much less professionalized, much less potent than the ones in Brasilia. But I couldn't really point to one outstanding case right now, so I mean...
Well, I mean, in general, like, so you lose the presidency, you lose all the patronage that's going to specific states, especially the Northeast, where they've won a lot. Like, is the PT basically going to be wiped out of state government for the next 10, 12 years?
It looks like the PT, which was a dominant presidential party in the Northeast the last 3 elections, is probably not going to be able to elect any further governors in the Northeast. I mean, that's what it looks like now. I mean, you know, things can change pretty rapidly, but their biggest and best state in the Northeast was Bahia, and Bahia still has a PT governor, I believe, right? The guy who succeeded, is that right? But the party was completely wiped out in the municipal elections in Bahia 2 weeks ago. And the guy who's the mayor of Salvador, the governorship is wide open to him 2 years from now. His name is Antonio Carlos Magalhães Neto. He's the most popular and most voted for mayor in Brazil, Salvador. So there's been a comeback of the traditional right in the Northeast actually in the last 2 to 3 years. So maybe we overstated the realignment. The realignment was a presidential realignment. And in fact, I'm writing a paper about that now where we look at the success of the right-wing parties in small municipalities throughout Brazil. And actually, they were strengthened by things like Bolsa, Familia, because they happened to be the incumbent mayors implementing a popular federal policy. So they were, again, pivotal mayors.
Last question?
Last question?
Yeah. Looking at the presentation, the historical landmarks, and everything, it looks like this is a Brazilian soap opera we might, face time by time, and how you frame the idea of presidential coalition, like institutionalism, basically. Looks like we might find sort of an alignment of parties, but at some point, maybe in 20, 25 years again, this particular frame are going to break again. The president might have to face again this kind of problem. If we frame it in institutionalism design, right? So my question would be, if you can see a particular characteristic or change in this crisis that actually developed to some sort of institutional change that might, consider novel.
That's a great question. I would say my answer would be not yet, because this saga, it's talking about soap operas. The biggest soap opera in Brazil is the so-called political reform, which never happens, right? So every 2 years, every 4 years, it's restarted. So the root cause of everything we talked about, coalitional presidentialism, is fragmentation, right? So if you want to try to make coalitional presidentialism a bit more user-friendly, you can manipulate the institutions to reduce the number of players. But the country has been actually galloping in the other direction. I mean, when Barry and I were working, we would say Brazil has 12 parties in Congress. For the next election, 19 parties in Congress. Then 26, then 28, now 32. So there's been no move to counter that tendency, right? So it used to be that the president's party might have 20, 30% of the seats. Now the president's party is reduced to 12, 13% of the seats. So it's a long way to 51 from 13. So, I mean, that's the root of everything, is proportional representation with high district magnitudes and no national threshold. It's like the U.S. Electoral College, I think, is the best comparison. It's like, everyone hates the U.S. Electoral College. We will never get rid of the U.S. Electoral College. Why? Because it empowers small states, veto players that will stop it from being modified. You'll never get a consensus to eliminate it. It's like fragmentation is like that in Brazil. It's like you need to get a Congress to approve the political reform. Well, how are you going to do that in a Congress with 32 parties, it's like turkeys voting for Thanksgiving. It's not going to happen.